a group of bikers burst into a diner and mocked an elderly veteran in a wheelchair, ripping the Vietnam patch from his jacket and laughing as he sat in silence. The next day, they showed up at their clubhouse, only to find it surrounded by hundreds of silent riders. No yelling, no threats, just respect so loud it didn't need a sound. What happened next left the whole town speechless. If you believe honor must be defended, type respect in the comments. The wind carried a crisp bite as it rustled the amber leaves along Main Street, whispering reminders that summer had finally given way. In the heart of this quiet town, where the rust on flagpoles outnumbered stoplights, a familiar figure moved slowly along the sidewalk. Raymond Ray Harris, 71, propelled himself forward with practiced hands on the wheels of his battered but well-kept wheelchair. His blazer was pressed, his white shirt buttoned to the collar, his posture upright despite the ache in his shoulders. Twin medals gleamed modestly on his lapel, one a bronze star, the other a combat infantry badge. Not flashy, not for show, just truth. Ray had just left the memorial park, where he'd spent the last hour sitting in silence beneath the marble wall engraved with the names of 46 hometown boys who never came home from various wars. He visited every Thursday afternoon without fail, no matter the weather. Sometimes he brought flowers. Sometimes just memories. Today, like most days, he brought nothing but himself, and that was enough. The bell above the diner door chimed as he entered, soft and unobtrusive. Inside, the scent of frying bacon and brewed coffee hung in the air like a familiar blanket. The place hadn't changed in 20 years. Checkered floors, faded booths, a pinball machine in the corner that hadn't worked since Clinton was in office. And yet it felt like sanctuary to Ray. Safe, known. From behind the counter, the waitress, Emily, offered him a warm smile. She was maybe 24, fresh out of community college, working mornings while applying to nursing schools. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris. Your usual?" He nodded. "Yes, thank you, Emily. And a glass of water, if you don't mind. A bit of a hill at the park today." She laughed gently, already preparing his coffee just how he liked it. Black, no sugar, 2 creams on the side. Ray wheeled himself to the corner booth near the window, the same one he'd chosen every Thursday since his wife passed 5 years ago. It had just the right amount of sunlight in the late afternoon, and a view of the memorial down the street. He didn't ask for anything more than this. A hot drink, a quiet place, and the knowledge that for at least a few hours a week, the world didn't expect anything of him except to be. The stillness inside the diner was broken by a distant rumble. Low at first, like distant thunder rolling over a flat horizon. Then it grew louder, unmistakable. The grinding roar of motorcycle engines echoed through the narrow street, sending a subtle tremor through the floor and drawing every eye toward the front windows. Heads turned. Forks paused mid-air. Emily glanced up from behind the counter, a crease forming between her brows. Outside, 6 bikes rolled in like a storm front. Chrome glinting in the sun, exhaust pipes snarling, tires crunching over loose gravel. They parked haphazardly across 2 spaces each, a deliberate show of indifference. On the backs of their leather vests, stitched in red and gray, a snarling wolf skull bared its fangs beneath the words Iron Fangs MC, East County Chapter. They were known in town. Loud, brash, always 1 drink away from making the news. Most folks just avoided eye contact and let them pass like a bad wind. The first to walk in was their leader, Troy Mercer, known locally, and only half-jokingly, as Fangs. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with tattooed arms that bore more ink than skin, and eyes that scanned the room like he owned the air everyone breathed. His walk was all swagger, chin high, shoulders wide. The kind of man who measured his worth by how many people looked away first. Behind him trailed 5 more, laughing, talking too loud, smelling of motor oil and stale beer. The quiet comfort of the diner evaporated as they entered. Conversations that had resumed since the initial rumble now halted entirely. An elderly couple in the booth near the jukebox lowered their heads. A young mother sipped her coffee a little faster. The laughter that once felt warm in the room turned hollow in the presence of too much ego. They spread out across 2 tables, dragging chairs noisily over the worn linoleum floor. One of them slapped the jukebox with a heavy palm. When it didn't respond, he laughed and muttered something crude. Troy sauntered toward the counter, slapping a 20 on it with more force than necessary. Burgers all around, rare, and a round of Cokes, real ones, not the diet crap. Emily didn't flinch, but the polite smile she offered was practiced, not genuine. Ray, still seated in his corner, watched them with a quiet gaze. He didn't scowl, didn't wince. He simply observed, the way a man does when he's seen louder men in more dangerous places and lived long enough to know that noise isn't strength. Not once did they notice him sitting there. Not yet. The hiss of the grill and clatter of dishes behind the counter offered a gentle rhythm to the late afternoon lull, trying to reclaim the calm that had been swallowed by the Iron Fang's presence. Troy Mercer leaned back in his chair, legs stretched out arrogantly, boots crossed at the ankles. His laugh was loud and sharp, less amusement than performance. He told a story about a bar fight 3 towns over, a tale where his fists always landed first, and everyone else ended up crawling. His audience, the other bikers, laughed on cue, though some laughter rang hollow, as though they weren't sure where the punchline had landed. Ray Harris sat quietly in the corner booth, sipping his coffee. He didn't stare, didn't interrupt, didn't offer so much as a glance in their direction. His wheelchair was tucked neatly beneath the table, his posture dignified. The pins on his lapel caught the light just enough to gleam, a bronze star and that infantry badge, subtle but impossible to miss if you were looking. And Troy, it turned out, had begun looking. Troy's eyes narrowed as he spotted the medals. He nudged the man beside him with a smirk and leaned just far enough back to raise his voice above the ambient noise, aiming it like a blade across the room. "Well, hell," he drawled, drawing out the syllables. "Would you look at that? We got ourselves a real tough guy in here." He pointed a grease-stained finger toward Ray. "All dressed up with his Sunday ribbons and wheels. What did you win those for, Gramps? Best traffic cone impersonation?" A few of the bikers chuckled. One let out a loud guffaw, slapping the table. Another looked down quickly, suddenly interested in his napkin. Emily froze behind the counter. Her smile faltered, the coffee pot in her hand trembling slightly before she set it down. Ray didn't respond. He didn't turn his head. His hands rested calmly on the edge of the table, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed should have said enough, but Troy didn't know how to read silence, not the kind Ray carried. "Don't tell me," Troy continued, louder now. "You roll up on the enemy and make 'em trip over your chrome wheels. That how you got your shiny pins?" More laughter. This time a few heads turned, not out of amusement, but discomfort. A couple at the front booth stood quietly, left cash on the table, and slipped out the door. Still, Ray said nothing. His stillness wasn't weakness. It was memory. Memory of real noise, of helicopters, gunfire, and the screaming quiet that follows when the dust settles and your friends don't answer back. The war had taught him many things. One of them was knowing when a battle wasn't worth the noise. So, Ray kept his peace. But the room had already begun to change. Something invisible had shifted, just beneath the surface. The air felt different now, and not one man in a leather vest noticed. Troy stood slowly, stretching as though he were shaking off boredom. His boots thudded heavily on the linoleum as he sauntered toward Ray's table. He moved like a man who had never been told no often enough. His smirk cocked just slightly, the gleam in his eye not playful but predatory. Ray didn't flinch as the biker approached. He continued sipping his coffee, gaze steady out the window as if Troy were no more than a passing shadow. It wasn't defiance and it wasn't fear. It was restraint, the hard-won kind born from decades of choosing dignity when fury would have been easier. Troy stopped just beside the table and leaned down, close enough for Ray to smell the faint trace of alcohol on his breath. Even at this hour. His fingers reached out, too fast for Emily or anyone else to stop, and snatched at Ray's jacket. The patch tore free with a rough sound, the stitching fraying at the edges as it gave way. "Vietnam, huh?" Troy said, holding it up between two fingers like it was something foul. 69 to 71? That's cute. He turned it over once, twice, then let it fall. It fluttered to the floor like a dying leaf. "Stolen valor," he muttered, not even loud, but with enough contempt to cut through the room. No one moved. No one breathed. Emily stood frozen behind the counter, one hand clutched to her apron, her mouth slightly open. A middle-aged man by the window shifted in his seat but looked away quickly when Troy's eyes swept the room. The sound of the coffee machine dripping behind the bar suddenly felt deafening in the silence. Ray looked down at the patch on the floor. He didn't speak right away. He set his cup down gently, then slowly reached over the side of his wheelchair. It took him a moment. His shoulders moved stiffly, joints complaining under old strain, but he picked it up, delicately, as though it were more than just cloth and thread. He turned it over in his hand, brushing off the dust, and reattached it the best he could, despite the torn edges. "I earned that patch," he said finally, his voice quiet, not soft, just measured, like a truth that didn't need defending. Troy scoffed and turned away, already bored, already done performing, but something hung heavy in the room now, a shame no one wanted to claim. Customers went back to staring at their food. No one met Ray's eyes. Not one person stood up. And yet Ray's back remained straight. The patch, though frayed, sat proudly again on his chest. Even stripped of silence, his dignity held. Bruised, yes, but not broken. Emily Rojas stood behind the counter, hands resting on the edge of the register, knuckles pale from how tightly she gripped it. Her breath had caught somewhere between Troy's second insult and the sound of fabric tearing. From her vantage point near the pie case, she had a clear view of everything. The way Ray Harris didn't flinch, the way his hand trembled only slightly when he reached for the patch, the way everyone else looked away like silence would shield them from shame. No one saw her reach into her apron pocket. She moved slowly, almost on instinct, as if her body understood something her mind hadn't yet put words to. Her fingers brushed past her order pad and pen until they found the familiar curve of her phone. She slid it out beneath the counter, shielding it behind the sugar jar and dessert menu. One tap, then another. Her camera began to record. The lens caught Troy's sneer as he dropped the patch and turned away. It caught Ray's hand trembling slightly as he brushed the dirt from the insignia, the patch now frayed at the edges like a memory worn thin from too much handling. It caught the way no one moved, no one offered help, no one dared to disrupt the silence. Emily's hand shook as she held the phone steady, not from fear, but from something harder to name. Her father, Sergeant Miguel Rojas, had served 2 tours in Iraq. He came back quiet, tired, and a little more haunted than when he left. He never spoke of the war, only of the men who didn't return, She remembered how he'd tucked his service medals away in a drawer, said they weren't for display, they were for remembrance. He used to say the most courageous men he ever knew were the ones who never bragged, never barked, never raised their voices in a room, just like Mr. Harris. She kept recording until Troy swaggered back to his table, still laughing like the sound could rewrite what had just happened. Her thumb hovered over the stop button, her heart racing with an urgency she didn't fully understand. All she knew was this felt wrong, not just the cruelty, but the silence that had followed it, the cowardice of looking away. Later, she'd question herself for not speaking up, but in that moment, she captured what words failed to stop. A quiet record of indignity and the man who bore it with grace. Emily tucked her phone back into her apron and blinked quickly, as if holding back something threatening to rise. She turned toward the coffee machine and poured a fresh cup. For Mr. Harris, though he hadn't asked for one. A small gesture, but hers to make. Ray placed his coffee cup back on the saucer with a quiet clink, the liquid inside barely disturbed. The room around him had returned to its false normal. Dishes clattered softly. Conversations murmured at half volume. The jukebox buzzed faintly in the corner, though no one had dared select a song. But the silence that lingered now wasn't peaceful. It was weighted, like fog thick with something unspoken. He reached into his blazer pocket and withdrew a neatly folded bill. With effort, he tucked it beneath the edge of his plate, careful to make sure it didn't flutter away. Always exact, always generous. Ray had never once left the diner without tipping above what the meal cost. A habit, Emily often thought, of someone who knew the price of things others overlooked. She approached the table, not speaking, just standing there for a moment with the fresh cup of coffee she'd poured minutes earlier. Ray looked up at her and offered a gentle, tired smile. The kind of smile that tried to comfort the other person instead of himself. "Thank you, Emily," he said, voice soft but clear. "Coffee's always good here." She opened her mouth to say something, anything, an apology, maybe, though none of this had been hers to cause. But the words dissolved before they could take shape. So she just nodded, clutching the cup in both hands as if it could anchor her in place. Ray adjusted the lapel of his blazer, where the patch now sat askew and ragged, held loosely by threads that had once been stitched by his wife's hands decades ago. He didn't try to fix it. Instead, he laid his fingers gently over it for a moment, then took a breath. "It's all right," he said, the words barely above a whisper. "I've been through worse." And then, with that same quiet dignity that had carried him through jungles, hospitals, years of forgotten service and silence, he turned his chair toward the door and wheeled himself out. The bell above the entrance jingled faintly as he passed beneath it. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the sidewalk in a golden haze. The breeze had picked up, rustling the trees along Main Street. Ray paused for a second just beyond the doorway, his silhouette framed in the light. His eyes scanned the horizon as though remembering some distant battle line. There was no bitterness in his face, but something deeper, an old wound not visible to the naked eye. The kind carried behind the sternum, the kind that never fully closes. And then, without another word, he moved on. The wind had shifted by evening, brushing cool across the porch railings of the assisted living complex just past town limits. A single light glowed in apartment 2B, its curtains half drawn, casting long shadows across the modest furnishings inside. Ray Harris sat by the window in his favorite chair, a thick wool blanket draped over his legs. Outside, the streetlights blinked to life one by one, illuminating the empty road like sentinels returning to duty. The day still lingered in his bones. He hadn't spoken to anyone after leaving the diner. just nodded to a woman passing by on the sidewalk and made his way home, his wheels humming quietly against the pavement. But now, hours later, that silence had settled deep inside him, not just around him. He didn't need anyone to tell him what had happened was wrong. He'd known that the second the patch hit the floor. What gnawed at him more than the insult was how familiar it had all felt. The way people looked away, the way they let it happen. Ray didn't expect anything different. Not anymore. He reached slowly toward the side table beside him, where an old, battered flip phone sat atop a worn copy of Winds of War. The phone's plastic was smooth from years of use, its buttons slightly faded. He opened it with care, as if it were a relic rather than a machine, and began pressing the keys with deliberate precision, thumbs slow, arthritis biting at each movement. Menu. Contacts. Flag echo channel. A blank message window blinked open. He stared at it for a moment, then typed, "Honor disrespected. Echo 1, location marked." He hit send. No signature, no plea, just a report. Ray snapped the phone shut and placed it back on the table. He leaned his head against the window and let his eyes follow the wind-stirred branches outside. In his younger years, he might have shouted, written a letter, demanded justice. But now, he understood something deeper. Not every wrong needs to be answered with noise. Sometimes it's enough to record it, to mark the breach. He didn't expect a reply. Not from the old group, scattered across states and years. Most were out of service, some by age, some by death, some just by choice. But a report still mattered. That's what the Army taught him. You report what matters. You honor the code. And sometimes, somewhere, the code still listens. Emily sat cross-legged on her twin bed, the faint hum of her old laptop filling the quiet of her apartment. The diner apron still hung over the back of her chair, stained with coffee and regret. She hadn't eaten since her shift ended, hadn't returned her mother's call. Her thoughts were stuck, looping the same moment over and over again. Ray's patch falling, his silence, her silence. The video was only 37 seconds long. She'd watched it a dozen times, each frame burned into her memory. Troy's voice, laughing. The sound of the patch tearing free. Ray's hand, steady despite the tremor, brushing off the dirt. No words of a protest, no one rising from their seat. And yet somehow, that quiet act of reclaiming what was his carried more weight than all the noise in the room. She didn't want to post it publicly. That didn't feel right. Not yet. But she remembered her dad talking about a veterans forum, hallowed grounds, a private online space where former service members and their families shared stories, asked for help, and found others who understood the weight of things most people didn't talk about. Emily logged in with the account her father had once made her set up just in case. She hadn't used it in years. She uploaded the video with a short caption. "This happened today. I didn't speak up when I should have. This man is a Vietnam vet. His name is Ray. I don't know what else to do, but someone should see this." She hit submit, and then she sat there in the silence, unsure of what she had just released into the world. At first, nothing. A few views. One comment, disgraceful. Then another. That patch means more than any of those loudmouths will ever understand. Within the hour, notifications flooded her screen. Dozens of replies. Then hundreds. Her inbox filled with messages from veterans, Gold Star family members, active duty soldiers. Some just wrote, "We see him." Others offered to find out who Ray was, to send him thanks, to do something, anything. By midnight, the clip had found its way onto encrypted vet networks, group chats with names like Echo Battalion, Old Guard Riders, Bravo Still Stands. What began as a moment of quiet shame had become a spark. Not just outrage, but reverence. A call that stirred something deep in those who recognized exactly what had been lost in that diner. Honor had been insulted. And somewhere, like an old bell tolling in the night, 100 quiet hands were already reaching for their gear. Morning came sluggish and gray, the kind of sky that made the asphalt look darker than it was. A light fog clung to the fields just beyond the tree line, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. At the edge of town, nestled behind a rusting chain-link fence, stood the Iron Fangs Clubhouse, a gutted old auto shop, its broken garage doors patched with scrap sheet metal and pride. Inside, the smell of old oil and burnt coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the low rumble of rock music from a speaker duct-taped to the wall. Troy Mercer sat on a ripped leather couch, boots kicked up on a crate, a cigarette burning lazily between his fingers. He was in good spirits, the swagger from yesterday still clinging to him like the smell of exhaust. Around him, half a dozen members of the Iron Fangs milled about, cracking jokes, tossing back cheap coffee, sharing exaggerated versions of the previous day's encounter. "Did you see the look on his face?" Troy said, grinning as he flicked ash onto the concrete floor. "Thought he was going to cry over that little patch, like I yanked his dog tags." They laughed. One of them mimicked a wheelchair, arms stiff, spinning in a mock circle. More laughter followed, echoing through the hollowed-out building. Not one of them noticed how the sound didn't carry far this morning, how it seemed swallowed by something waiting just beyond the thin walls. Outside, the fog began to lift. They didn't see the first few cars pull into the lot across the street. Not flashy cars, mostly pickups, dusty sedans, a few motorcycles with quiet engines and long-distance wear. They came without revving, without fanfare. They parked with practiced precision, side by side, like formation drills never truly left the body. Men and women stepped out. Some wore leather vests bearing patches from other riding clubs, Patriot Riders, Silent Sentinels, Ghost Recon vets. Others wore jeans and jackets, the kind of clothing that didn't say much unless you looked closely and knew what to read. The silver pin of a fallen comrade, a worn desert camo cap, a faded battalion insignia tattooed just above the wrist. They didn't shout, they didn't rush, they just came. And inside the clubhouse, the Iron Fangs kept laughing, unaware that silence had gathered outside, not the kind that signaled absence, but the kind that signaled arrival. A storm was forming, but not with thunder, with memory, with purpose, with eyes watching. Just before noon, the sound broke through the stillness like a slow heartbeat, one deep, throaty engine echoing over the asphalt. Not the aggressive revving of the Iron Fangs, but something steadier, lower, like thunder holding its breath. The first Harley rolled down the road leading toward the Iron Fangs clubhouse. Matte black, clean but worn. The rider sat tall, back straight despite the years weighing on his shoulders. On the back of his vest, the patch read Patriot Riders with a pair of dog tags stitched below. He didn't look at the building as he passed it. He didn't need to. He knew where he was going. Another followed, then another. Soon, the curve in the road became a steady stream of chrome and leather. Bikes of every shape and build, Harleys, Indians, Goldwings, each one bearing insignias of clubs with names that carried weight far beyond patches. Ghost Recon Vets, Warhorse Brotherhood, Semper Riders, Shield Bearers MC. They came not in a roar, but in a hum, controlled, disciplined. Riders kept formation 2 by 2, peeling off quietly into the gravel lot across from the clubhouse. They weren't there to be seen. They were there because something sacred had been disrespected, and in their world, that meant something. By 12:15, nearly 60 bikes lined the opposite curb. Riders dismounted wordlessly. Some removed their helmets, others kept them on. No one laughed. No one spoke louder than necessary. Men and women alike stood quietly, boots planted firm, arms crossed or at their sides. A few nodded to each other. A few simply stood with hands in their pockets, eyes on the rusted building in front of them like it was a war zone they were waiting to enter. Some wore vests decorated with tours that spanned decades: Vietnam, the Gulf, Fallujah, Kandahar. Others bore only a single patch: KIA Brother Never Forgotten. Many moved with subtle signs of pain, limps, braces, the stiff caution of old wounds, but none of it seemed to slow them. A woman in her 50s stepped from her bike and removed her gloves. Her hair was tucked into a braid, her jacket lined with deployment pins. She nodded at a younger rider as she passed, her voice low and steady. "Echo 1?" He nodded once. Confirmed. Inside the Iron Fang's clubhouse, the music still played. The laughter still rose. But outside, in the growing shadow of quiet resolve, something larger than noise had arrived. Something measured. Something watching. The kind of presence that didn't need to speak to be heard. By 1 o'clock, the lot was full. And still, they kept coming. From the north and south ends of the road, bikes arrived in slow, measured intervals. Single riders, pairs, full rows. The growl of engines filled the air like a quiet procession, the kind reserved for parades or funerals. No honking, no shouting, just presence, deliberate, steady. What began as a loose gathering evolved with unspoken coordination, as though instinct had taken over where orders once lived. Without command or signal, riders began to reposition their bikes. Not toward the road, not toward escape, but inward, toward the Iron Fang's clubhouse, until the building sat encircled on all sides by steel, chrome, and stillness. Bikes lined up fender to fender. Sidewalk to gravel. No gaps, no voices. Men and women stood beside their machines, some in full riding gear, others in denim vests over old service jackets. A few wore nothing to signify who they were or what they'd done. But if you looked close enough, it was all there, in the way they stood, in the eyes that never darted, in the posture that had long forgotten what it meant to flinch. 200 strong, at least. The circle formed quietly, patiently, with the precision of something ancient and sacred. There were no drawn weapons, no threats, just a living wall of remembrance and resolve. Their presence was not a warning. It was a reminder of sacrifice, of oath, of a code written in blood, carried home in silence and violated in a moment of cheap cruelty by men who never knew what it meant to bleed for something. Inside, the Iron Fangs were only beginning to notice the stillness creeping in. The music still played, but it now felt distant, like it didn't quite belong to this hour. A few members glanced through the dusty windows, their smirks faltering as they noticed the rows of bikes stretching down both sides of the street. Troy stood up, brushing crumbs off his vest. What the hell? No one answered him. Outside, no one spoke. Not a single raised voice. Just the quiet command of presence. Hundreds of veterans standing at parade rest, eyes fixed on the building that had briefly become the epicenter of something far bigger than its rusted walls. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that demands respect. The sound of boots on pavement broke the stillness. Not rushed, not loud, but steady, deliberate. Every step punctuated the air like a drumbeat no one dared speak over. Out of the long line of riders emerged a man whose very frame seemed carved from discipline. Broad shoulders squared beneath a weathered leather vest, his posture proud despite the clear stiffness in his gait. He walked with a limp, not the kind that begged for pity, but the kind that told a story. One of service, of injury borne without complaint, of battles remembered not for glory but for cost. On his vest were patches faded from sun and years. Some were unit insignias: 101st Airborne, 3rd Infantry, Ranger Tab. Others were less official, stitched by hand or worn into the leather. Never above you, never below you, always beside you. Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan. A combat action badge gleamed near his chest, but it was the insignia at the top that told everyone who he was without a word. Command Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks, return. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a fist. He just kept walking, parting the circle of riders like a tide, their heads nodding in quiet recognition as he passed. His presence carried something heavier than authority. It carried history. The kind of weight that can't be faked or borrowed. The kind that had been earned one decision at a time under fire. He stopped about 10 feet from the Iron Fang's clubhouse entrance, his eyes scanning the rusted structure, the shuttered garage doors, the cracked windows. His expression didn't change. It didn't need to. He had seen worse in places that never made the news. Behind him, the circle held firm. Inside, Troy had approached the window, hands on his hips, his smirk now wavering. When he saw Elijah, his brows furrowed, maybe with recognition, maybe just the sense that something had shifted outside his control. Elijah said nothing for a long moment. Just stood there, the wind catching the edge of his vest, his eyes like steel under a storm-gray sky. He didn't look like a man who came for vengeance. He looked like a man who came for truth. Then he stepped forward again toward the door, his limp more pronounced now but still steady. And with each step, the weight of every uniform he'd ever worn followed him. He wasn't just one man. He was every man who ever stood when it was easier to sit. The knock on the metal door was firm, not aggressive, just enough to announce presence without demanding entry. Inside the clubhouse, the Iron Fangs had fallen into an uneasy stillness. The music had been turned down, the jokes faded. The laughter now felt too loud in memory. Troy glanced toward the window again, then back to the door. He hesitated, not out of fear, but confusion, the kind that creeps in when the game shifts and no one tells you the new rules. He opened it with a jerk, trying to project the same swagger he always wore like armor. But it faltered the moment he met Elijah Brooks face to face. Elijah didn't speak right away. He looked at Troy with eyes that had stared down insurgents in foreign deserts, that had seen boys under his command bleed out in the dirt and kept moving forward because there was no choice. He saw the patches on Troy's vest, the theatrical skulls, the flames, the snarling wolf. He saw the hollow behind the bravado. "Elijah Brooks," he said finally, his voice low, steady. "Command Sergeant Major, United States Army. Retired." Troy smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching in defense. "Yeah? You here to give me a speech, old man?" Elijah didn't rise to the bait. He never blinked. "We're not here to fight," he said plainly. "We're here because something sacred was trampled yesterday. And when that happens, we show up." Troy laughed once, short and sharp. "You people take yourselves way too seriously. It was a joke, just a harmless jab at a guy playing dress-up in a wheelchair. If he can't take that, maybe he shouldn't be wearing those patches." Elijah stepped closer, not menacing, but unyielding, the way a mountain is unyielding. He wasn't playing, Elijah said, and those patches weren't for show. They were earned, in the jungle, in blood, carrying brothers who didn't make it home, and you mocked that, in front of a crowd who did nothing. That's why we're here. Troy's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked unsure. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't about hurt feelings. It's about honor. You don't have to like the man, but you will respect what those patches stand for. Because if you don't, then you're standing on the graves of better men than you'll ever know." He stepped back then, just enough to let the weight of the moment settle. "We're not here for vengeance," he repeated. "We're here to remind you that silence doesn't mean absence, and dignity doesn't stay down when kicked." Troy stood in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw set, eyes scanning the silent formation beyond the fence. The iron fangs lingered behind him, suddenly smaller in the face of the gathering outside. They had built their reputation on noise, roaring engines, loud boasts, the illusion of power. But nothing felt louder now than the silence pressing in from all sides. Then, without cue or signal, a voice rose from the crowd. A man in his late 40s stepped forward from his bike, his desert camo jacket faded, the name tag above his heart half frayed. He took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that carried too many sleepless nights. He looked straight at Troy. "Name's Mark Henson," he said. "1st Infantry Division. Iraq, 03 to 04. My best friend, Private Jim Kelly, took shrapnel in Fallujah. He died in my arms. We were 22. He never got to wear the medals they gave him afterward. Ray Harris reminds me of him. That man you mocked, he's the kind who didn't leave people behind." He stepped back into formation. Another stepped forward. A woman this time, maybe early 60s, hair pulled into a tight braid. Her riding vest bore a small cross and the emblem of the Warhorse Brotherhood. "Colonel Dana Wright," she said, voice even. "U.S. Army Nurse Corps, Vietnam. I held the hands of men younger than my own son while they bled out on operating tables made of plywood. Men who screamed for their mothers, who asked if their medals would get sent home if they didn't make it. That man in the wheelchair, he's the reason I made it back." Then another and another. Each rider stepped forward like witnesses to something sacred. They didn't speak with anger. They spoke with memory. Some shared names of the fallen. Others shared silence, only holding up patches or dog tags, letting their presence speak instead. One man simply placed his prosthetic hand on his chest and nodded, eyes rimmed with tears he didn't wipe away. No one shouted. No one accused. But the message was clear. They were not faceless. They were not ghosts. They were living history, wounds and all, and they had not come to intimidate. They had come to account, to say, "We saw what you did," to say, "We remember who he is," to say, "Some things are not yours to mock and walk away from." They didn't want vengeance. They wanted acknowledgement. The soft whir of wheels over pavement broke the stillness. Emily appeared from the far end of the circle, walking slowly beside a worn wheelchair. Ray Harris sat upright, hands resting lightly on the armrests, blazer pressed, his weathered face calm and composed. The patch on his lapel, frayed but reattached with careful stitching, caught the sunlight like a quiet flag raised again. No one said a word as he entered. Veterans shifted slightly to make way, creating a path without needing to be asked. Heads dipped. Some offered nods. One man, eyes brimming, brought his fingers to his brow in a silent salute. Ray met no one's gaze, but he saw everything. He felt it in the silence that no longer weighed heavy with shame, but stood tall with reverence. Emily walked beside him with a quiet determination, her expression solemn. She hadn't spoken a word since picking Ray up from his apartment that morning. She didn't need to. Her presence was apology and tribute all at once. Ray stopped at the center of the circle, not 10 feet from the clubhouse door where Troy still stood, arms crossed, face now unreadable. Elijah gave a single nod to Ray, a subtle gesture of respect from one old warrior to another, and stepped aside. Ray looked directly at Troy. No bitterness in his face, no heat in his words. "This isn't about me," he said, voice low but steady. "Never was." He let that sit for a moment. The wind rustled through the circle, catching the ends of jackets and the edges of flags stitched onto sleeves. "It's about all of us who were never allowed to come home in one piece. The ones who came back with scars you can't see, the ones who didn't get to come back at all, the ones who sit alone on Memorial Day hoping someone remembers their name." He paused. The silence was absolute now. "You didn't just mock a man in a wheelchair. You mocked every name carved into stone, every folded flag handed to a mother, every set of boots that came home empty." Troy looked away for the first time. Ray took a breath, not from anger, but weariness, from the weight of years carried without complaint. "We don't need you to understand what we've been through," he said. "We just need you to remember that we were there." Then he turned slightly, looking out at the circle, his voice softening. "And that we still are." Troy Mercer stood at the threshold of the clubhouse, the door half open behind him, as if some part of him still hoped to step back inside and shut all of this out. But there was no going back now, not through that door, not through time, not through silence. He had spent most of his life commanding rooms through noise, laughter, intimidation, barked orders soaked in arrogance. He was the man who always had something to say, who wore confidence like armor, slick and loud. But now, in the center of a ring of solemn faces, there was no room for noise, only truth. And truth had no interest in volume. The air around him was heavy, not hostile, not violent, just honest. The kind of honesty that didn't blink, didn't break eye contact, didn't need fists to make its point. These people hadn't come to shout, they'd come to stand, and that was what undid him. Ray's words still echoed in the space between them. "You mocked every name carved into stone." Troy's fingers twitched against the side of his jeans, restless, unsure of what to do now that swagger had no place to land. He glanced around, searching for some familiar smirk, a nod of support from his crew. But the Iron Fangs stood in the background, quiet, eyes down. One of them shifted uncomfortably and turned away. Another looked as though he might step forward, then thought better of it. They weren't with him now. Not really. He tried to speak, to form something clever or dismissive to break the tension, but the words lodged somewhere in his throat, tangled in the realization that for the first time he wasn't facing an audience. He was facing judgment. Not the kind you escape with a laugh, the kind you carry. Troy looked at Ray. Really looked. And for a flicker of a second he saw past the blazer and the chair and the medals. He saw the man who had returned from a war that never fully ended. The man who had stayed quiet when it would have been easier to yell. The man who had endured disrespect not with rage, but with dignity. And somehow that dignity felt heavier than any threat Troy had ever known. The silence continued. Not accusing. Just waiting. Troy looked down, and for the first time he didn't feel taller than the man in front of him. He felt small. Elijah took a step forward, his boots echoing softly against the pavement, though the air around him remained hushed. He didn't loom over Troy. He didn't need to. Authority hung on him like an old coat, worn, weathered, but unmistakably his. He looked at the younger man not with anger, but with the steadiness of someone who had seen the cost of too many foolish decisions made too late. "You've got a choice," Elijah said, voice level. "You can walk away from this moment unchanged. Pretend it didn't matter. Let it be just another story you twist around to make yourself feel bigger. Troy's jaw clenched, his eyes flickering to the ground, to the crowd, back to Ray. There was nowhere to run, but more importantly, nowhere left to hide. Or, Elijah continued, you can understand. The silence between them stretched again. Wind rustled through the circle. Somewhere nearby, a flag clinked softly against a pole. I'm not talking about guilt, Elijah said. I'm talking about respect. You don't get it by demanding it, or by wearing leather with skulls on it. You get it by showing up for people who can't ask anymore. You get it by putting your back into something that isn't about you. He turned, bent slightly, his limp more visible now, and picked up a small folded vest that had been resting atop the seat of a nearby bike. It wasn't like the Iron Fang's patchwork. No flaming symbols or snarling beasts. Just simple navy canvas, clean stitching, and a rectangular tag on the front pocket. Veteran Volunteer Corps, Community Service Division. Elijah held it out. This vest, it's earned. Not with noise, not with pride, with time, with work, with hours spent listening when it's uncomfortable, showing up when no one's watching. Cleaning memorials, delivering groceries to housebound vets, sitting with a man who doesn't speak anymore and still calling it a conversation. Troy didn't reach for it. Not yet. But his eyes locked onto the vest like it was a mirror, showing him the kind of man he wasn't and could still become. You want respect, Elijah said, his voice firm. Start earning it the hard way. He didn't push the vest into Troy's hands. He let it hang there in the air between them, patient and unmoving, as if waiting for the weight of it to be truly understood. Then he added, more softly, we all had a first day. And the circle waited. Troy stood frozen, staring at the vest hanging between him and Elijah like a question only he could answer. His fingers twitched at his sides, fists half-formed and then forgotten. The wind brushed lightly through the rows of parked bikes, carrying the quiet weight of expectation. No one rushed him. That, perhaps, was the hardest part. There was no pressure, just presence. A circle of men and women who had already made their choice. He shifted on his feet, his bravado slipping further with each passing second. His eyes scanned the crowd, desperate for something to hold on to, some familiar face that might pull him out of this reckoning. But all he saw were solemn expressions, calm stares, and a truth reflected back at him he wasn't sure how to face. Then a voice broke the silence. Not Elijah's, not Ray's. It came from behind Troy, gravelly and low. They're right, Troy. Everyone turned. An older man stepped forward from the Iron Fang's side of the lot, removing his sunglasses with a slow, almost reluctant motion. He wore the same cut-off vest as the rest of them, Iron Fang's patch bold on the back, but his walk was different. Not performative, just tired. I served, he said plainly. Did a tour in Nam. Never talked about it, not once. Figured no one cared. Troy blinked, startled. Frank? The older man nodded. Yeah. You didn't know. I didn't want you to. Didn't think it mattered. But I watched what happened yesterday. His voice cracked, not with emotion but restraint. And I didn't say a damn thing. That's on me. I should have stopped it. The air shifted. Even Elijah looked at the man with a new depth of recognition. I joined this club, Frank continued, because I thought it was about brotherhood, about remembering the guys who didn't make it back. But somewhere along the line, we made it about noise and image, leather, patches, beer, bikes. He turned toward Troy, his gaze steady. We forgot what this was supposed to be about. Troy looked away. Frank stepped closer. You don't have to be the guy who did that yesterday. Not forever. But if you keep pretending it didn't matter, you'll carry that weight in ways you won't even realize. And one day, when the noise fades, it'll be the only thing you hear. The circle remained silent, holding space, and the vest in Elijah's hands waited, still and unclaimed. A gust of wind stirred the dust along the edge of the lot, brushing against chrome and canvas like breath through tall grass. The silence hadn't broken. It had deepened, grown fuller somehow, richer with meaning. And then, slowly, it shifted. A rider near the far side of the circle stepped back. Another followed. Without command or signal, the wall of veterans began to part, not in retreat, but in reverence. They didn't scatter. They opened. The ring of bikes eased apart just wide enough for movement between them. As the gap widened, riders began stepping forward, not rushing, not crowding, just approaching with the solemnity of mourners at a graveside. Some offered Ray a firm nod, the kind that carries decades of understanding in a single glance. Others paused, stood at attention, and delivered crisp, silent salutes, shoulders squared, eyes unwavering. Ray didn't speak. He couldn't have if he'd wanted to. The moment swelled around him, not with noise but with gravity. The kind of gravity that settles on a man's shoulders when the world finally sees the burden he's carried alone for too long. A tall woman in her 40s stepped forward from the Ghost Recon vets. Her jacket was worn but immaculate, her boots polished to a mirror shine. In her hand, she held something small, folded in a square of velvet. She knelt before Ray, not to lower herself but to bring herself level, eye to eye. And with care, she lifted the patch she held. It was the same Vietnam 1969 to 1971 insignia that had been torn from his blazer the day before. Only now, it bore a new detail, a delicate border of gold stitching, hand-embroidered with reverence. The simple phrase stitched underneath glinted faintly in the afternoon sun. Honor restored. She pressed it gently against Ray's lapel, fastening it with a strong pin. Her fingers moved with care, with respect, with the unspoken promise of those who remember. Ray's hand rose to cover it. Eyes misted, but he said nothing. She rose without a word and stepped back. The circle of riders, now broken and reformed in something more intimate, surrounded Ray not as sentries, but as brothers and sisters. They didn't need speeches or cheers. They didn't need an audience. What had been taken in public had now been returned in quiet. Not just a patch, but dignity, and the world had watched. It began as a trickle. Just a few grainy phone clips posted by onlookers who had witnessed the gathering from across the street, their voices hushed behind the lens. A video showing Ray Harris being wheeled into the circle. Another capturing the moment the bikes formed a ring around the Iron Fang's clubhouse, engines silent, every rider standing at parade rest. No yelling, no threats, just presence, just gravity. The stillness spoke louder than any outburst ever could. Within hours, those videos multiplied. Angles from different corners of the lot. A close-up of Command Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks offering the volunteer vest. The woman pinning the restored Vietnam patch to Ray's lapel. 1,000 small windows into one moment of collective reckoning, stitched together by something larger than outrage. Reverence. Social media lit up, not with fury, but with something deeper. Hashtags began to emerge. Hashtag Stand with Ray. Hashtag Honor Rides. Hashtag Echo Unreported. They climbed the ranks steadily, not driven by algorithms or shock, but by shared purpose. Veterans across the country reposted the footage with quiet captions. We remember. This is what it looks like. Dignity doesn't need noise. By late afternoon, Local news stations picked up the story, then regional outlets. Before sunset, a national morning show had scheduled a segment. Anchors didn't embellish. They didn't need to. The footage told its own story. A man disrespected. A community that stood. A nation reminded. Veterans from all branches weighed in. Some shared their own stories of being ignored, mocked, dismissed in public. Others spoke of redemption, of strangers who had stepped forward when it mattered most. One former Marine posted a simple photo of his shadow next to a war memorial and wrote, "We don't need parades. We just need to be seen." Military families posted photos of medals in drawers, jackets that hadn't been worn in years, and loved ones who never came home. Gold Star mothers commented under the videos, thanking the writers not just for what they did for Ray, but for what they did for every name on every stone across the country. The footage didn't show anger. It showed resolve, and perhaps that's why it spread so far, so fast. Because in a world addicted to shouting, something quiet had stood up and held the line. A story where no one demanded a spotlight, and yet the light came anyway. Not to glorify, but to witness. The old garage doors had been replaced. The rusted siding scrubbed and painted a deep, solemn navy blue. The Iron Fang's snarling skull emblem was gone, stripped from the brick, replaced by a new hand-carved wooden sign above the entrance. The Brotherhood Post. No flames, no fangs, just the silhouette of two soldiers, one helping the other to his feet, etched in quiet reverence. The transformation hadn't been funded by any grant or politician. It came from calloused hands and late nights, from donated lumber, from riders and veterans and townspeople who brought what they had. Time, labor, memory. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it stood on ground where something ugly had happened and where, just weeks later, something better had taken root. Inside, the oil-stained concrete floor had been resurfaced and polished. The back room was now a small meeting space, lined with shelves holding military books, framed photos, and resource guides. The kitchen had been updated to host weekly meals for local veterans. An office had been carved out of the corner to provide free counseling. Another corner served as a quiet room, its walls hung with letters from school children and newspaper clippings of the day. The bikes formed their silent ring. Outside, a modest crowd gathered under a cool October sky. Veterans in jackets and caps stood beside locals in jeans and Sunday boots. Cameras were present, but stayed respectfully back, kept at bay by the tone of the event. This wasn't for headlines, it was for healing. Ray Harris sat beneath the news sign, a simple navy blanket across his lap, his hands folded in thought. He hadn't wanted a ceremony, said so more than once, but when they insisted on a ribbon cutting, he made one request. "Let me say no." A red ribbon stretched across the new entryway. Scissors were placed gently in Ray's lap, but he didn't reach for them. Instead, he turned to Elijah Brooks, who stood nearby, his leather vest crisp and his face unreadable as ever. Ray looked at the crowd, then back at Elijah. "I didn't build this," he said quietly. "I just reminded folks why it needed to be." He offered the scissors to Elijah, who hesitated, then took them. "This one's for the living," Ray said, voice gravel rough but sure, "and for those who never got the chance to come home and walk through doors like this." Then he leaned back, hands in his lap, as the ribbon was cut. No applause followed, just a long silence. And then the doors opened. The morning sun broke gently over the rooftops of the small town, casting long golden streaks across Main Street. The air held the crispness of early fall, and the sidewalks were lined not with balloons or banners, but with people. Quiet, respectful, still. They didn't come to cheer. They came to witness. At precisely 10 o'clock, the low rumble of engines echoed from the east. Not a roar, nothing for show, but the familiar grounded rhythm of riders moving together in quiet formation. At the center of them rode Ray Harris, seated not in his usual wheelchair but in a custom-built sidecar, sleek, low to the ground, painted deep navy with a single gold stripe down the side. A brass plaque near the footrest read simply, "For the ones who never came home." Emily walked beside it as it rolled into view, her father riding the bike itself. He'd spent weeks building the sidecar in his workshop, refusing payment, working by lamplight after long shifts at the garage. Said it was the least he could do. Ray wore his blazer, the newly embroidered Vietnam patch stitched proudly back onto the lapel. His face was calm, eyes scanning the crowd. No smiles, no waves, just quiet acknowledgement. He didn't want attention, never had. But he allowed this, not for himself, but for what it meant. The street was lined with townsfolk, store owners, teachers, retired mill workers, high school students in Letterman jackets. Children stood holding small flags. Veterans in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder with those in street clothes, some saluting, some with hats over their hearts, others simply standing because they didn't know what else to do but knew they had to do something. As the procession moved slowly down Main Street, the only sounds were the steady hum of engines and the soft shuffling of boots on pavement. At one corner, a teenage boy removed his earbuds and stood straighter, his eyes following Ray's path with quiet reverence. Across the street, a woman held her father's hand as he wiped a tear from beneath his weathered cap. There were no speeches, no music, no grand declarations, only presence. And as they passed the war memorial near the edge of town, Ray turned his head slightly, gazing at the stone where the names of the fallen were etched deep into the granite. He gave a single nod, barely noticeable, but unmistakably meant. Later, when a reporter asked him how it felt to see such a tribute, Ray just shrugged, a faint smile touching the edge of his mouth. "Respect doesn't require noise," he said. "It just needs to show up."